There was a time when every serious RC flyer knew exactly what was hanging on the wall behind the hobby shop counter. Gold-faced, precise, heavy in the hand in the way that quality things are heavy, not from excess but from intention. The Kraft transmitter. You either had one or you wanted one, or you knew somebody who flew with one and watched his plane move through the sky like it was reading his mind. Then one day, it wasn't there anymore. No announcement, no farewell, no final run of a special edition to mark the passing of something that had mattered. The shelf where the gold-faced boxes used to sit got filled with something else. Japanese lettering, lower price points, a different kind of future. And the men who had grown up flying Kraft radios stood in those aisles and felt something they couldn't quite name. Not anger, not even grief, something quieter than both. What happened to Kraft Systems is not a simple story. It is a story about a world champion who built the finest radio control equipment America ever produced. And what a conglomerate, an import wave, and a pivot nobody saw coming did to everything he built. It starts in a garage in Pasadena. It ends in silence. Phil Kraft did not set out to build an empire. He set out to solve a problem that was making him furious. It was 1962, and Kraft was working as a manufacturer's representative in Southern California. The kind of job that put him in hobby shops and RC clubs up and down the coast, selling other people's equipment to men who wanted to fly. He knew the hobby better than most. He had been flying radio-controlled aircraft since the early 1950s, competing at the club level, studying the mechanics of how a signal traveled from a transmitter in a pilot's hands to the control surfaces of a model moving through the air 100 yards away. He understood what good RC equipment felt like, and what he was selling did not feel good. The radios available to American hobbyists in the early 1960s were, by any technical standard, inadequate, glitchy, inconsistent. Prone to interference from other transmitters on the flight line, a pilot could build a beautiful airplane, spend months shaping balsa, covering it with silk, tuning the engine, and then lose it in 60 seconds because his radio hiccuped at the wrong moment. Kraft had watched it happen too many times. He had watched grown men walk across an empty field toward a pile of wreckage that used to be something they were proud of. He decided he could build something better. He was 36 years old. He had a USC engineering background, a sales territory, and a garage in Pasadena. That was enough to start. The first thing he did was call his mother. Virginia Kraft was not an engineer. She was an insurance agent. Steady, practical, the kind of person who understood what it meant to carry risk and manage it carefully. When her son told her he was going to leave his sales job and build radio control equipment out of his garage, she did not talk him out of it. She sold her insurance agency and came to work as the company's comptroller. That decision, a mother liquidating her livelihood to fund her son's conviction, is not a footnote in the Kraft Systems story. It is the foundation of it. Without Virginia's capital and without her financial discipline in the early years, there is no company to speak of. Kraft Systems opened for business in October 1962. The product line was narrow by necessity. Phil designed what he could build, tested it himself, and sold it through the same network of hobby shops he had been calling on for years. The early transmitters were not flashy, they were engineered. There is a difference, and hobbyists who flew them knew it immediately. A cleaner signal, a more consistent response, a feel in the hands that suggested the person who designed this equipment had actually flown with it. Word moved fast through RC clubs. It always did. A pilot would show up at a field with something that worked better than what everyone else was flying, and by the end of the afternoon, people were asking where he got it. By 1964, demand had outgrown the garage. Kraft leased an industrial space in South El Monte, hired his first employees, and started running something that looked, for the first time, like a real manufacturing operation. He was still competing. That mattered. Phil Kraft was not a businessman who happened to sell RC equipment. He was a pilot who happened to run a company. He flew in regional and national competitions through the mid-1960s, refining his designs against the best flyers in the country, bringing what he learned back to the drawing board. Every product that came out of South El Monte carried that feedback loop inside it. The men who bought Kraft equipment were not just buying a radio. They were buying the accumulated judgment of someone who had stood on a flight line and needed his equipment not to fail. By 1966, the company had outgrown South El Monte. Phil began looking for land. For a long time it was enough, more than enough. In September 1967, Phil Kraft flew to Ajaccio, Corsica, and won the World Radio Control Championships. He was competing in precision aerobatics. a discipline that demanded total command of an aircraft at distance, reading wind, anticipating drift, executing maneuvers with a machine that could not feel what the pilot felt and could only respond to what the transmitter sent. The margins were narrow, the competition was international, and Phil Kraft, flying his own design, a sleek pattern ship called the Quick Fly, won it. He came back to California as the best RC pilot on the planet, flying equipment that bore his own name. The timing could not have been better, or more deliberate. Within a year of Corsica, Kraft Systems introduced the Gold Medal series. The name was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. This was the equipment the world champion flew. A 6-channel gold medal set carried a retail price of $450 in 1968, the equivalent of nearly $3,000 today. That was not an impulse purchase. That was a serious hobbyist making a serious commitment. And the men who made it knew exactly what they were buying into. Not just a radio, a standard. By 1968, the company had 80 employees and was grossing $2 million a year. Phil had already identified what he needed next. Land, 7 acres in Vista, California in San Diego County, far enough from the Los Angeles basin to give the operation room to grow, close enough to the aerospace and electronics corridors of Southern California to pull from the talent that lived there. He bought the land, commissioned a purpose-built factory, and in 1969 moved the entire operation south. The Vista facility was built the way Phil Kraft built everything, to a specific standard, with a specific purpose, and with no intention of outgrowing it quickly. The factory floor hummed with assembly work. Technicians wound coils and soldered circuit boards in a climate that allowed year-round production, without the humidity problems that plagued manufacturers in other parts of the country. The parking lot filled early. Shifts ran clean. The company had the particular energy of a place where the people making the product understood what the product was for. In 1970, Kraft Systems did $2.5 million in sales. The total American model airplane industry that year was estimated at $15 million. Kraft held a substantial share of that market. Not bad for a company that had started 8 years earlier in a garage with a mother's insurance money and a pilot's frustration. Phil recruited carefully. In the mid-1970s, he hired Doug Spreng, an engineer who had worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. Spreng brought with him the kind of precision systems thinking that JPL demanded: tolerance for complexity, intolerance for sloppiness, and a deep understanding of how electronic signals behaved under real-world conditions. He became one of the central technical figures in Kraft's development operation, part of a small group of engineers who pushed the company's designs forward year after year. In 1976, that work produced something significant. Kraft Systems introduced the first synthesized RC system available to American hobbyists. Synthesized frequency control meant a pilot could dial in a specific channel electronically rather than swapping crystals by hand. A cleaner, faster, more reliable solution to the frequency management problem that had complicated flying since the hobby's earliest days. It was the kind of innovation that came from engineers who flew, who understood the problem not as an abstraction, but as something they had experienced on a flight line with the wind changing and other pilots waiting their turn. By 1977, the Vista factory was producing 400 units a week. 150 people worked the floor. By 1981, that number had grown to 250, and Kraft Systems had become Vista's third largest employer. The company's products sat on the top shelf of hobby shops from California to Florida in catalogs that serious flyers kept on their workbenches and marked up with notes. The gold medal transmitter was more than a product. It was a credential. A pilot who flew Kraft was making a statement about what kind of flyer he was, or aspired to be. Fathers bought them for sons who showed promise. Instructors flew them at club fields where beginners watched and quietly made plans. The brand carried weight in the way that only a few brands in any hobby ever managed to carry weight, not because of advertising, but because of performance. And because the man whose name was on the box had stood on the world stage and proven what his equipment could do. None of them knew the factory had already begun dying. In June 1972, Phil Kraft sold his company. The buyer was Carlyle Corporation, a Cincinnati-based conglomerate with holdings spread across construction materials, industrial manufacturing, and consumer products. Carlyle was not a hobby company. It was not an RC company. It was not run by people who flew. It was run by people who read balance sheets And what the balance sheet of Kraft Systems showed them in 1972 was a profitable, growing enterprise in a specialized market with strong brand recognition and limited competition. That was enough. The acquisition went through, and Kraft Systems became a division of something much larger than itself. Phil Kraft stayed on as president. That was the arrangement. The founder retained operational control, continued to lead the engineering and product development work, continued to put his name and his reputation behind what came off the floor in Vista. On paper, it looked like continuity, and for a while, it functioned like continuity. The factory kept running. The products kept improving. The gold medal series remained the standard against which every other American RC system was measured. But something had shifted. It is difficult to pinpoint from the outside. There are no internal memos, no documented board meetings, no recorded conversations between Phil Kraft and Carlisle's executives that have entered the public record. What hobbyists who flew through this period noticed, according to accounts that have circulated in the collector community for decades, was a gradual change in the feel of things. Not a dramatic degradation, not a sudden collapse in quality. Something subtler, a sense that decisions were now being made with one eye on a spreadsheet that Phil Kraft had not previously needed to consult. Conglomerates do not acquire companies because they love what those companies make. They acquire them because they believe the financial returns will justify the purchase price. And the mechanism by which a conglomerate extracts those returns, cost management, margin optimization, standardization across divisions, is almost always in tension with what made the acquired company worth buying in the first place. The tension is not always visible immediately. Sometimes it takes years to surface. But it is almost always there, working quietly beneath the daily operations of a place that still looks, from the outside, like it did before. At Kraft Systems in the early and mid-1970s, the factory kept building. The product line kept expanding. Phil kept flying and competing and refining. In 1974, the company was hired by 20th Century Fox to build the radio-controlled model helicopters used in the towering Inferno, a commission that put Kraft equipment in front of a film audience of millions and underscored the precision that the brand had become known for. In 1976 came the synthesized system. In 1970, the Beton Turchdar, Ifendasininstisevent, 400 units a week, 150 employees. By any external measure, the company was thriving. But on the other side of the Pacific, something was changing that no American RC manufacturer had yet found an adequate response to. Japan's electronics industry had spent the post-war decades doing what it did with extraordinary discipline, studying American products, improving on their weakest points, and manufacturing at a scale and cost structure that American factories, with their higher wages and overhead, could not easily match. In the consumer electronics space, televisions, audio equipment, cameras, this process had already reshaped the American market through the 1960s. RC equipment was a smaller, more specialized category, but the same dynamics applied. Futaba had been making RC systems since the early 1960s. By the mid-1970s, Futaba and JR, along with Sanwa, were producing equipment that American hobby shop owners could import at price points significantly below what Kraft was charging for comparable channel counts. The Japanese systems were not inferior. In some respects, particularly in the precision of their servo mechanisms, they were advancing rapidly, and they were cheaper. Not slightly cheaper, substantially cheaper. A pilot walking into a hobby shop in 1976 or 1977 faced a choice that had not existed 5 years earlier. The Kraft Gold Medal set was still the prestige option, the credential, the standard, the transmitter that the serious flyers flew, but the shelf next to it now held alternatives that worked, that came with warranties, that were backed by distributors who were investing in the American market with serious intent. The Kraft name still meant something, but meaning something and holding market share are not the same thing. And in the back offices of the Vista factory, under Carlisle's ownership, the numbers were beginning to tell a story that the flight line had not yet confirmed. They called it a competitive challenge. They had not yet called it a crisis. That distinction would not last. The hobby shop shelf does not lie. By 1979, the shelf had changed. Not dramatically, not yet. The Kraft Gold Medal sets were still there, still occupying the premium position, still carrying the weight of a name that every serious flyer recognized. But the shelf had grown. Futaba boxes now stood beside them. JR boxes. Sanwa. Each one priced lower, each one backed by a Japanese manufacturer with a domestic production base that did not carry the labor costs of a Vista. California factory running 250 American workers. The math was not complicated, it was just slow. Slow enough that the men running Kraft Systems under Carlyle's ownership could tell themselves, for a while longer, that the situation was manageable. It was not manageable, it was a tide. The Japanese manufacturers had not stumbled into the American RC market accidentally. They had studied it, entered it deliberately, and invested in distribution networks and dealer relationships with the patience of companies that were playing a long game. Futaba, in particular, had built a servo mechanism, the small electric motor that actually moves a control surface when the transmitter sends a signal, that American engineers acknowledged was precise, durable, and produced at a cost that American manufacturing could not match without fundamental changes to how the factory operated. JR was not far behind. By the early 1980s, the two of them together were capturing an increasing share of the American hobby shop market that had once belonged almost entirely to domestic brands. Kraft's response was the response of a company caught between two pressures it could not simultaneously resolve. On one side, a founder whose identity was inseparable from the quality standard his name represented, and who had spent 2 decades building that standard with engineers like Doug Spreng. On the other side, a conglomerate ownership structure that needed the division to perform financially in a market that was becoming, quarter by quarter, more hostile to American price points. The tension that had been working quietly beneath the surface since 1972 was no longer quiet. Under Carlyle's ownership, the company pivoted. The pivot began in earnest around 1981. Kraft Systems, the company whose name was synonymous with RC, transmitters, whose gold medal series had defined what serious radio control equipment looked and felt like for more than a decade, began developing computer joysticks. The reasoning was not irrational on its face. The personal computer market was expanding rapidly. Peripherals were a growth category. Kraft had genuine engineering expertise in the design of handheld control devices. The mechanical and electronic skills that produced a precise RC transmitter were not entirely unrelated to the skills required to produce a precise joystick for an IBM PC or an Apple II. The company filed a trademark for Micromouse in December 1982 and followed it with filings for Thunderstick, Triple Track, and Top Track through the late 1980s and into 1990. The irony was not lost on the hobbyists who were paying attention. The same cultural shift that was pulling young Americans toward computer screens and away from flying fields, the same migration of attention from the physical, outdoor, patient work of RC aviation toward the immediate, indoor gratification of video games and personal computing, was now the market that Kraft Systems was chasing with its engineering resources. The company that had defined the golden age of American RC flight was pivoting toward the technology that was helping to end it. Whether that irony registered inside the Vista factory in whatever meetings produced these decisions is not documented, but it registered outside, among the men who had grown up flying Kraft radios and now watched the company's identity blur and shift in ways they had not expected. Meanwhile, the RC line continued, but with diminishing resources behind it. The engineering investment that had produced the synthesized system in 1976 and the innovations of the late 1970s was now being divided across 2 product categories. The Japanese competition was not standing still. Futaba and JR continued to refine their systems, continued to expand their American dealer networks, continued to offer price points that pulled entry-level and mid-range buyers away from American brands. The top of the market, the serious competition flyers, the aerobatics pilots who had always been Kraft's core, held on longer. But the top of any market is not large enough to sustain a factory of Kraft's size indefinitely. By the late 1980s, the company had begun outsourcing portions of its production to East Asia. The Vista factory that Phil Kraft had built on 7 acres of San Diego County land, the factory that had been Vista's 3rd largest employer, was running at a fraction of its former scale. The 250 workers of 1981 were a memory. The parking lot that had filled before sunrise now had gaps in it that nobody officially acknowledged. The gold medal series, once the standard against which all American RC equipment was measured, was no longer setting the standard. It was trying to hold a position in a market that had reorganized itself around competitors who had entered that market when Kraft was at its peak and had not stopped improving since. By the end of that decade, the only question left was when, not if. The final years of Kraft Systems did not announce themselves. There was no press release. No industry publication ran a feature on what was happening inside the Vista factory as the 1990s began. The hobby press, the magazines that had covered Kraft's innovations, that had reviewed the gold medal series and reported on Phil Kraft's competition results, had moved on to covering the Japanese systems that now dominated the market. Futaba and JR were the story now. American RC manufacturing was not a story anyone was writing about, because the narrative of decline is rarely visible to the people inside it until it is nearly complete. What the remaining workers in Vista experienced in those final years was the particular exhaustion of a place running on reduced expectations. The engineering staff had thinned, the RC product line had contracted. The joystick division, Thunderstick, Triple Track. The computer peripheral products that Carlisle's ownership had bet on as the path forward was competing in a consumer electronics market that was itself consolidating rapidly, with larger players absorbing shelf space and distribution channels that smaller manufacturers could not match. The pivot that was supposed to save the company had landed in a market nearly as difficult as the one it was trying to escape. Phil Kraft's role in the company's final years is not well documented in the public record. What is documented is the structure. Carlyle Corporation owned the operation, and the decisions that determined the company's direction were made within that ownership framework, not by the man whose name was on the building. Whether Phil Kraft watched what was happening and said nothing, or said something and was not heard, or had by that point withdrawn his attention to the competition flying and the Ferrari restoration work that would occupy his retirement, none of that has entered the record. What is clear is that the company he founded in a Pasadena garage in 1962, the company his mother funded by selling her insurance agency, the company that had won a world championship and put American RC engineering on a pedestal that the entire hobby recognized, that company was running out of runway. The RC line went quiet first. At some point in the early 1990s, the precise date is not documented in sources available to researchers, Kraft Systems effectively exited the radio control transmitter market. The product that had defined the company, the gold medal series that had carried Phil Kraft's reputation and Virginia Kraft's sacrifice and Doug Sprang's JPL-trained precision into the hands of pilots across America, was no longer being produced in meaningful quantities. The hobby shops that had stocked Kraft on the top shelf were now ordering Futaba and JR exclusively. Some of them had been doing so for years. The transition, when it finally completed itself, was not dramatic. It was just finished. What remained was the joystick operation, a company now called Kraft Systems, producing computer peripherals under brand names that most of its former customers had never heard of, in a factory that bore less and less resemblance to the place that had once employed 250 people, building the finest RC equipment in America. The identity had inverted completely. The name survived. What the name had meant did not. In 1994, Kraft Systems went defunct. The intellectual property, the trademarks, the product designs, the brand assets that remained, was sold to Microspeed Inc., a computer peripheral company based in Fremont, California. Microspeed wanted the joystick product lines, the peripheral technology, the commercial infrastructure that Kraft had built in its final pivot. The RC transmitter heritage, the gold medal series, the synthesized system of 1976, the engineering legacy that Doug Sprang and Phil Kraft and a generation of Vista workers had built over 3 decades. None of that transferred in any meaningful way. It did not fit into what Microspeed needed. It simply ended. Phil Kraft retired to Oceanside, California, 20 miles south of the Vista factory he had built. He was 68 years old. He spent his retirement doing what he had always loved alongside flying, collecting and restoring exotic Ferraris, the kind of mechanical work that demanded the same precision and patience that RC Aviation had always required. He did not, as far as the public record shows, speak extensively about what had happened to his company. He had built it, he had sold it. He had stayed on and watched it change, and then he had stepped away. He died on April 9, 2006. He was 79 years old. Parkinson's disease. He was inducted into the AMA's Model Aviation Hall of Fame, a recognition that came from the flying community, from the people who remembered what the gold medal transmitter had felt like in their hands and what it had meant to fly with equipment that the world champion himself had designed. The gates of the Vista factory did not close with a ceremony. They closed with a sale to a computer peripheral company and a silence that settled over 3 decades of American RC engineering like static over an empty frequency. The hobby shops are still there. Not all of them. Many did not survive the decades that followed, but the ones that remain have walls behind their counters, and on those walls hang transmitters, Futaba, Spectrum, Flyski. The names have changed with every generation of technology, and the technology has changed in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to the men who stood at the Vista factory workbenches in 1977, assembling gold medal sets 400 units a week. There is no Kraft on the wall. There hasn't been for 30 years. The Vista factory site on Hall Road has moved on in the way that industrial properties move on, repurposed, reoccupied, carrying no visible sign of what was built there or who built it. The 7 acres that Phil Kraft purchased in 1968, the land where he commissioned a purpose-built factory and moved his entire operation south from Los Angeles, do not announce their history. There is no marker, no plaque. The industrial buildings of San Diego County are not in the business of commemorating what they used to be. What survives exists in 2 places. The first is the collector market. Kraft gold medal transmitters appear on eBay with some regularity, gold-faced, worn at the edges, sometimes still in their original cases with the documentation intact. The men who list them tend to describe them in a particular way, not just as vintage equipment, but as the transmitter they learned on, or the one their father flew, or the one they saved up for in 1974 and used for 15 years before the hobby moved on without them. The prices they fetch are modest by collector standards. What they carry is not monetary. It is the specific weight of something that was made with care in a specific place, by people who understood what they were making and why it mattered. The second place is the AMA Museum in Muncie, Indiana, where Phil Kraft's contributions to the hobby are documented with the seriousness they deserve. Exhibit materials reference the World Championship, the Gold Medal Series, the synthesized system, the 19 aircraft designs that Phil put his name to over his career, including the Quick Fly that won in Corsica and the Ugly Stick that became one of the most widely built RC trainers in American hobby history. The museum holds what the factory site does not, a record that says this happened, that it mattered, and that the man who built it was not ordinary. Virginia Kraft, who sold her insurance agency in 1962 so her son could build radios in a Pasadena garage, did not live to see the company's end documented and preserved. Her contribution to what Phil built is not widely known outside the RC community. It should be. Every gold medal transmitter that ever left the Vista factory carried, somewhere inside it, the cost of a decision she made when she was asked to believe in something that did not yet exist. Doug Sprang, the JPL engineer who brought precision systems thinking to the Vista engineering floor, moved on when the company moved on. The work he did in the 1970s, the synthesized frequency control system, the refinements that kept Kraft competitive into the early years of the import wave, exists now only in the equipment that survived, in the hands of collectors who run the old transmitters through their paces at club fields and note still how clean the signal is. Phil Kraft died in April 2006. He was 79. The RC community marked his passing with the quiet respect of people who understood what they had lost. Not a celebrity, not a public figure in any mainstream sense, but the man who had looked at the radios available to American hobbyists in 1962 and decided he could build something better, and had. And for 30 years, in a factory in Vista, California, that is exactly what he did. There are pilots who still fly Kraft equipment at vintage RC meets. Men in their 60s and 70s who bring out the gold-faced transmitters the way other people bring out photographs. They stand at the flight line with the old hardware in their hands and put their planes through maneuvers that the modern crowd watches with a kind of respectful curiosity. The equipment still works. The signal is still clean. The standard that Phil Kraft set in 1968 holds up 50 years later against everything that came after it. What it does not do is come back. The frequency is clear, the sky is there, but the transmission ended in 1994, and nobody, not microspeed, not the collector market, not the passage of time, has found a way to resume it.